bankruptcy filing was done, signed, sealed, and announced to the entire world. Ava Caldwell sat alone in the lobby of Caldwell Industries, watching her employees carry out their belongings in silence, each one walking past her without a word. Decades of work were walking out those doors, and there was nothing left to say. She reached for her coat, ready to leave everything behind, when a janitor in a gray uniform rushed toward her, breathless, holding a printed spreadsheet. He looked her directly in the eyes and said, "You missed this number." Ava Caldwell had spent the better part of the last 3 years watching her company bleed. It didn't happen all at once. It never does. It started with the expansion into the Southeast markets, a decision the board had championed with charts and projections that looked bulletproof at the time. Then came the supply chain disruptions that nobody predicted, followed by a series of contracts that fell through in ways nobody had prepared for. Caldwell Industries, a manufacturing company that had been operating for over 4 decades, had stretched itself too thin trying to grow too fast. And the weight of that miscalculation was now impossible to ignore. She had built her career on precision. Every decision she made came after layers of review, financial modeling, and risk assessment. She had inherited the company from her father, but she had also rebuilt it in her own image, leaner, more structured, driven by data rather than instinct. The people who worked under her trusted the systems she put in place, and for years those systems had delivered results. But somewhere in the past 3 years, those same systems had failed to catch what was happening underneath. And by the time the numbers became impossible to argue with, the damage was already done. The board meeting had taken place 3 days earlier. The room had been quiet in the way that rooms only get quiet when everyone already knows what's coming. But nobody wants to be the first to say it out loud. Richard Hayes, the company's chief financial officer, had stood at the front of the table and walked through the numbers one more time. Liabilities, exceeding assets, cash reserves, depleted creditors circling. He had done it calmly, methodically, the way a doctor delivers a terminal diagnosis, because at some point you run out of ways to soften the truth. By the end of the presentation, there was nothing left to debate. The board voted, and Ava signed. The announcement went out the following morning. A press release was clean and formal, stating that Caldwell Industries would be filing for bankruptcy protection. Ava had read it over twice before approving it, changing nothing because there was nothing to change. Every word was accurate. Every number was verified. The company's legal team had reviewed everything the financial auditors had signed off, and the outside consultants brought in over the past 6 months had all reached the same conclusion independently. There was no second opinion left to seek. Only the fact of it sitting there in 12-point font, waiting to be sent. By mid-morning, the building had already started to empty. Ava stood near the entrance of the main lobby and watched it happen in real time. Employees she had worked alongside for years filed past her, some carrying boxes, some carrying nothing at all. Most of them keep their eyes forward. A few stopped to say something brief, "Thank you," or "I'm sorry," or nothing coherent at all. Just a look that carried everything words couldn't hold. Ava received each one the same way with a small nod and a steadiness. She had trained herself to maintain it even when she didn't feel it. She was still the CEO, and she would carry herself like one until the last person walked out the door. But standing there in the lobby, she felt the weight of it in a way the board meeting had not quite allowed. In that room, she had been in execution mode, processing information, making decisions, managing the sequence of events with the efficiency that had defined her entire professional life. Here there was nothing left to manage. There was only the reality of what had happened, and the people moving through it, and the particular kind of silence that fills a large building when life is slowly draining out of it. Liam Brooks had been working at Caldwell Industries for a little over 2 years. He was a single father who lived simply and kept his obligations organized the way a person does when they have learned to depend entirely on their own reliability. He came in every morning before most of the office staff arrived, worked methodically through his route, the main floors, the conference rooms, the executive hallway, and finished his shift in the early afternoon. He was quiet in the way people are quiet when they are genuinely comfortable with their own thoughts. Not because they have nothing to say, but because they are in the habit of observing before speaking. He had been watching the company's slow deterioration the same way he watched everything else carefully without rushing to conclusions, paying attention to details that other people walked past without registering. Over the past several months, Liam had noticed things, not because he was looking for them, but because his job placed him in spaces at hours when most people weren't paying attention, early mornings in the finance department hallway. Late afternoon passes through conference rooms where printouts were sometimes left on the tables. He wasn't the kind of person who went looking for information that wasn't his to have, but he also wasn't the kind of person who ignored something that didn't add up once he had already seen it. What he had seen in a summary report left on the edge of a table near the end of the previous week was a number that sat wrong with him in a way he couldn't quite shake. He had gone over it in his mind more than once. He had no formal training in accounting or corporate finance. But before he had taken this job, he had spent years managing the books for a small family operation, tracking cash flows on a scale that was nothing like what Caldwell Industries dealt with, but that had given him a working understanding of how financial summaries were supposed to behave. And the number he had seen in that report didn't behave the way it should. It was subtle, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it, easy to explain away if you were in a hurry, but it was there, and once he had seen it, he couldn't unsee it. On the morning the announcement went out, Liam had read the press release like everyone else. He read it standing in the break room with a cup of coffee, and the feeling that had been sitting in the back of his mind for days sharpened into something more urgent. By the time his shift was ending and he saw Ava still standing in the lobby, watching the last wave of employees move toward the exit, he had already made up his mind. He crossed the floor with the printed report in his hand, moving faster than his usual measured pace because he understood that the window for this conversation was closing with every passing minute. Ava saw him coming from across the lobby. She recognized him the way you recognize someone you have seen every day without ever having a real conversation, a face that belongs to the background of a place present but peripheral. She had no reason to expect what came next. She had no reason to expect anything at all from this moment, because as far as she was concerned, there were no more moments left to have. And then he was standing in front of her, slightly out of breath, holding a sheet of paper, and the words he said landed harder than anything she had heard in that boardroom 3 days prior. Her first instinct was the same instinct that had driven every major decision of her career, to assess quickly whether the source of information in front of her was credible, and by every conventional measure she had ever used, it wasn't. He was a janitor. He had no seat at any table where these decisions had been made, no access to the full picture, no credentials that would earn him a second look from her finance team. She had spent the last 6 months working with some of the most experienced financial consultants in the industry, and all of them had arrived at the same conclusion. The idea that this man standing in front of her in a gray uniform had found something they had all missed. It should have been easy to dismiss, but she didn't dismiss it. Something in his expression stopped her. Not desperation, not the look of someone grasping for relevance in a moment that had nothing to do with him. He looked like someone who had checked his reasoning more than once before crossing that floor. He looked in spite of everything certain. And Ava Caldwell, who had built an entire career on knowing the difference between real conviction and noise, found that she could not make herself walk away. She looked at the paper in his hand and said, "Show me." The two of them moved to a side office off the main lobby, one of the smaller rooms that had already been cleared of most of its contents, a desk and 2 chairs left behind, like furniture that wasn't worth the effort of moving. Liam set the printed sheet down on the desk and smoothed it flat with the edge of his hand. He pointed to a figure in the lower section of the cash flow summary, a consolidated number that represented the net operating position across 3 of the company's regional divisions. He explained slowly and without embellishment that the figure didn't reconcile with the individual division breakdowns listed earlier in the same document. The gap wasn't enormous on its face, but in a summary of this kind, a gap like that shouldn't exist at all. Ava studied the page without speaking. She traced the column with her finger, moving from the consolidated figure back up to the line items that were supposed to feed into it. Liam was right that something didn't add up, but she had spent enough time reading financial documents to know that what looked like an error on a summary sheet could have a dozen legitimate explanations: a rounding method, a timing difference, a currency conversion that hadn't been reflected in the printed version. She didn't want to let the weight of the day push her toward a conclusion that wasn't there. She needed someone who could run this down properly, and that meant calling Richard Hayes back in. Richard arrived 20 minutes later, still in the suit he had worn to the announcement that morning. He walked into the side office, saw Liam standing near the desk, and his expression shifted in a way he didn't fully bother to conceal. He looked at Ava and said, "What is this about?" His tone wasn't hostile, but it carried the particular kind of impatience that comes from a man who believes a matter has already been settled. Ava told him she needed him to look at the cash flow summary again, specifically the consolidated figure for the 3 regional divisions. Richard's jaw tightened slightly as he picked up the sheet. He looked at it for a long moment and then set it back down. He said the discrepancy was likely a formatting artifact from the way the third-party audit software had exported the data that it had come up briefly during the review process and been accounted for in the final calculations. His voice was measured professional, the voice of someone who had handled enough financial crises to know how to project calm authority. But when Ava asked him to show her exactly where in the final calculations it had been accounted for, Richard went quiet in a way that was different from his earlier composure. He said he would need to pull up the source files. It took him nearly 40 minutes to do it. During that time, Ava sat at the desk while Liam stood near the door saying nothing further, having already said everything he came to say. 2 members of the finance team arrived at some point. A senior analyst named Derek Walsh and one of the junior members of the audit coordination team. Both of them were summoned by Richard, both of them carrying the same look of thinly veiled disbelief that their work was being reopened on the day the company had officially declared its collapse. Derek made the case firmly and with considerable technical detail that the consolidated figure had been validated through multiple checkpoints, and that what Liam had identified was a display inconsistency, not a substantive error. He said it with confidence. He said it with charts. But when Ava asked them to run the raw data inputs through the model again from scratch, not from the exported summary, the room shifted. It took Derek's team the better part of 2 hours. Ava didn't leave. She sat in that stripped-down office and waited while the rest of the building continued to empty around her, the sounds of departure drifting in from the hallway like background noise from a life that was already ending. When Derek came back in, he didn't lead with an explanation. He set his laptop on the desk and turned the screen toward Ava without saying a word, because the numbers on the screen said everything that needed to be said. The error was a data entry mistake in one of the regional input files, a transposition that had inverted a positive operating figure, turning what should have been a substantial asset into an apparent liability. Because the error had been introduced at the source level, it had propagated cleanly through every subsequent layer of the model. Every report, every projection, every consolidated summary had been built on top of it. The auditors had validated the structure and the formulas. They had not gone back to verify the raw inputs, because the raw inputs had been provided by the company's own internal team, and that team had assumed they were accurate. No single person had done anything wrong in isolation. The system had failed because everyone had trusted the layer above them without anyone checking the foundation beneath. When the corrected figures were run through the model, the picture that emerged was different in ways that mattered enormously. The company was not in the position it had believed itself to be in. It was still under serious pressure. There was no version of this that was clean or simple, but the specific threshold that had triggered the bankruptcy filing. The point at which liabilities had been declared to exceed recoverable assets was no longer where the numbers said it was. Caldwell Industries had not crossed that line. Not yet. The filing had been premature. Ava sat with that for a long time before she said anything. The room was quiet except for the sound of Derek's team running additional verifications in the background, checking and rechecking because none of them wanted to be the person who confirmed a finding this consequential, and turned out to be wrong. When the checks came back consistent, when Derrick looked up from his screen and gave a small, stunned nod, Ava finally spoke. She said she needed the full corrected analysis documented and ready for review within the hour. Then she looked at Liam, who was still standing near the door, and said, "Thank you." She said it simply without the kind of elaboration that would have made it smaller. What followed was not a celebration, because there was nothing to celebrate. A bankruptcy announcement had gone out to the public, to creditors, to investors, and to the media that morning. Retracting it was not a matter of sending a correction. It required a full legal and financial disclosure process, a re-engagement with every party that had already begun acting on the news, and a public explanation that would raise as many questions as it answered. Ava understood immediately that the discovery of the error did not rescue the company. It changed the nature of the crisis, but it did not end it. The board had to be reconvened. That call lasted just over 2 hours, and it was not a comfortable one.
Several board members expressed relief that the filing had been premature, but that relief came wrapped in fury. Fury at the process that had allowed a data entry error of this magnitude to pass through every layer of review undetected.
Fury at the public exposure the company had already sustained, and fury, though most of them didn't say it directly, at the fact that the error had been identified not by any member of the finance team or the external audit firm, but by a janitor who had noticed something on a printout left on a table. That last part was the one that nobody quite knew how to hold. In the days that followed, the investor response was swift and predictable. Several of the company's largest institutional investors had already begun the process of unwinding their positions when the announcement dropped that morning. A retraction of the bankruptcy filing did not undo the signal that had been sent. It added a layer of confusion on top of it, which in many ways was worse. Markets respond to clarity even when that clarity is bad news. What they don't respond well to is a company that announces it is collapsing and then announces within the same business day that it might not be, because the conclusion that announcement leads investors to is not relief, but a deeper question about whether the company's leadership knows what it is doing at all. Ava read every piece of coverage that came out over the following 48 hours. She read the analyst notes, the investor statements, the editorial pieces that were already framing the situation as a governance failure rather than a financial one. They weren't wrong. The financial error was the mechanism by which the crisis had arrived, but it was not the root. The root was something she found herself sitting with alone in her office late in the second night after the retraction, when the immediate chaos had settled enough for her to stop moving and start thinking. She had built her company on systems on the belief that if you constructed the right processes, hired the right people, and put the right controls in place, the outputs would be reliable. And for a long time, that belief had held. But what the error had revealed was something her systems were not designed to catch: the assumption at every level of the organization that the work done by the layer below was correct. Her finance team had trusted the inputs. The auditors had trusted the structure. The board had trusted the final reports. Nobody had questioned the foundation. And the reason nobody had questioned it was that her organization had never made that kind of questioning feel like a legitimate act. The kind that doesn't require a title or a credential, only attention and the willingness to say something out loud. Liam had done exactly that. Not because his job required it, not because anyone had sanctioned it, but because something had seemed wrong to him, and he had not talked himself out of what he saw. He had crossed that lobby knowing full well that every reasonable expectation in the building suggested he would be dismissed without a second thought. And in doing so, he had exposed not just a number in a spreadsheet, but a question about the entire culture. She had spent years building a culture in which the only voices that ever reached the top were the ones the structure had already decided were worth hearing. That was the failure beneath the failure. And sitting alone in that office, Ava finally understood it clearly enough to name it. Naming the problem and knowing how to solve it were two different things. And Ava understood that clearly enough not to confuse them. The external work of the past week, the legal retraction, the investor communications, the board calls, had required the kind of focused, sequential problem solving that she had always been good at. What was waiting for her now was harder because it didn't have a deadline, and it couldn't be managed through a process. It required her to look honestly at the kind of leader she had been and decide without the comfort of a clean framework what kind she intended to become. She had built Caldwell Industries into a place where competence was respected and results were rewarded, and she had genuinely believed that was enough. What she had not built, what she had not even thought to build, was a place where the person farthest from the executive floor felt that speaking up was worth the risk. She had created a machine that ran efficiently, as long as every input was correct. She had not created a place where catching a wrong input was understood as everyone's responsibility regardless of job title. That distinction, which had seemed like a minor philosophical point before, now felt like the most consequential thing she had ever failed to understand about leadership. The board meeting she called the following week was different from any she had run before. There were no presentations queued up, no consultants in the room, no prepared remarks moving through a structured agenda. Ava stood at the front of the table and told the board directly, and without the buffer of carefully selected language, what she believed had happened and why. She did not frame the data entry error as the central failure, she named it as the symptom. The central failure, she said, was a leadership environment in which the only voices that reached the decision-making level were the voices that the structure had pre-approved as credible. She said she had designed that environment, and she took full responsibility for it. And she was not there to ask the board what they thought should happen next. She was there to tell them what she intended to do. Several board members pushed back. Thomas Wren, the longest-serving member of the board, and the one who had been most visibly furious in the days following the retraction, made the case that what was needed was a structural fix, better auditing protocols, mandatory secondary review of all raw data inputs, stronger third-party verification at every stage of the financial reporting cycle. He was not wrong. Those things were necessary, but Ava told him they were insufficient, and she told him why. Because a structure fixes the mechanism of the failure, and the mechanism was not where the failure had started. The failure had started in the space between what people saw and what they felt empowered to say. No audit protocol reached that space. Only culture did. The public statement Ava released at the end of that week was not drafted by the company's communications team. She wrote it herself, going through 4 complete drafts over the course of 2 days, and in the final version, she said things that her legal counsel strongly advised against saying. She named the error clearly and without euphemism. She described how it had moved through the system undetected. She acknowledged that the bankruptcy announcement had been premature, and she acknowledged that the conditions which had made that possible, the gaps in oversight, the absence of independent verification at the input level, the culture that had made difference safer than scrutiny, were conditions she had allowed to exist. She did not use the word unfortunately. She did not use the phrase despite our best efforts. She said what had happened, and she said it was her responsibility, and she said she was going to fix it. The response was not immediately positive. It rarely is when a person in a position of authority says something unambiguously true at a moment when the audience has already decided how they feel about the situation. Several analysts wrote that the statement was either admirable or catastrophic, depending on how the market interpreted leadership candor under pressure. Investors who had already begun distancing themselves did not come rushing back. But a number of the company's larger creditors, who had been in conversation with Caldwell's legal team about restructuring terms, shifted the tone of those conversations in a direction that suggested the statement had registered as something other than damage control. Creditors who have spent careers listening to executives manage their way around accountability tend to notice when one doesn't. Inside the company, the response was different and more immediate. The employees who had returned after the retraction, and a substantial portion of them had returned because the corrected financials had allowed the company to resend the termination notices that had gone out, responded to the statement in the way that people respond when they recognized something as honest. There was no sudden surge of morale. No dramatic shift in the building's atmosphere. It was quieter than that. But in the days after the statement went out, Ava began to hear things in one-on-one conversations with department heads and team leads that she had not heard before. Observations, concerns, Questions about processes that people had apparently been carrying for some time without a clear sense that they were welcome to surface them. She listened to every one of them without interrupting, which was not something she had historically been good at. The structural reforms came in parallel. Richard Hayes resigned in the week, following the public statement quietly, by mutual agreement, in a conversation that was brief and professional, and left nothing unresolved. Derek Walsh stayed, and Ava kept him because the failure had not been Derek's alone, and she was not interested in using departures as a substitute for genuine change. A new internal audit protocol was built from the ground up, one that required independent verification of source-level data before any summary figures were incorporated into board-level reporting. The finance team was restructured to include a dedicated data integrity function. A small team whose only job was to trace reported figures back to their raw inputs and flag any inconsistency, however minor, before a document moved forward. Beyond the structural changes, Ava began something harder to name and slower to build. She started holding open sessions once a month. Not town halls in the traditional sense, not a stage and a microphone and a curated set of questions, but small group conversations with rotating groups of employees from different parts of the company, in which the explicit premise was that the most useful information she was likely to receive would probably come from people whose job titles gave no obvious reason to expect it. She called them observation sessions, which was not a perfect name, but it was accurate. She went in with questions and came out with things she hadn't known to ask about. It was uncomfortable at first in the way that any real change is uncomfortable, not because it required effort, but because it required relinquishing a version of herself she had spent years constructing. Liam was still working his regular shift through all of it. He had not sought any kind of visibility in the weeks after the lobby had not given interviews or accepted the attempts from a few people on the communications team to make him the face of a recovery narrative. He came in each morning, did his work, and left in the early afternoon the way he always had. Ava approached him directly one morning about 3 weeks after the public statement and asked if she could speak with him for a few minutes. They sat in the same side office where everything had started, still mostly empty, still the same 2 chairs. And Ava told him that she was formalizing a new role within the company's internal oversight function, a position specifically designed to bring in perspectives from outside the traditional finance track, and that she wanted him to consider it if he was interested. She told him she wasn't offering it because of what he had done for the company, though what he had done was significant. She was offering it because of how he had done it, the quality of attention he had brought to something that was technically none of his business, and the willingness to act on what he saw even when every reasonable expectation argued against it. Liam listened to all of this without expression, and then he said he would think about it, and Ava told him there was no rush. He came back to her 2 days later and said yes. He said it without ceremony the way he said most things, and Ava accepted it the same way. What happened after that was not dramatic in the way that corporate recovery stories tend to be told. There was no single moment of triumph, no press event with a turnaround headline. The company's financial position stabilized over the course of the following months as the restructured operations took effect and the creditor agreements held. Several of the investors who had walked away came back. Not all of them, but enough. The board dynamic shifted, not without friction, but in a direction that Ava felt for the first time in years was actually moving towards something rather than just holding position. What changed most visibly to the people inside the building was not the org chart or the audit protocols or the monthly sessions, though all of those things mattered. What changed most visibly was Ava herself. The version of her that had run the company for the better part of the previous decade had operated on the assumption that certainty was a form of leadership, that projecting confidence in the system was how you kept people moving in the right direction. The version that emerged from everything that had happened understood that certainty, when it becomes a posture rather than a conclusion, is just a sophisticated way of not listening. She asked more questions now. She sat with ambiguity longer before resolving it. She had learned slowly and without enjoying the process that the most important information in any organization rarely arrives through the channels built to carry it. There was a morning roughly 8 months after the day of the lobby when Ava arrived at the building earlier than usual and stood in the main entrance for a moment before the workday started. The space looked the same as it always had. The same high ceilings, the same front desk, the same stretch of floor that she had stood on, and watched her company's life drain away. She thought about what it had taken to still be standing here. Not a better financial model, not a more rigorous audit process, not a smarter consultant. It had taken one person deciding that what he noticed was worth saying in a building that had never explicitly told him it was. That was a narrow margin. And the work she had committed to the sessions, the restructured protocols, the slower and more deliberate way she now moved through decisions, was the work of making that margin wider, so that the next time something was wrong, the organization would not need to depend on one quiet man crossing a lobby at the last possible moment to find it. In any organization, the most dangerous failure is not the one the systems fail to catch. It is the one that no one feels permitted to name. The error in that cash flow report could have been found by anyone who looked closely enough. The reason it wasn't found until the last possible moment was not a failure of intelligence or diligence. It was a failure of culture, a culture that had quietly taught its people that the weight of a voice was determined by the title attached to it. What Liam did in that lobby was not heroic in the conventional sense. He did not solve the problem. He did not have the authority or the expertise to solve it. What he did was simpler and rarer. He saw something, and he said something in a place, and at a moment when everything around him suggested that neither was his place to do. A company that can produce that kind of person, not through luck, but through the environment it deliberately builds, is not a company that depends on getting every number right the first time. It is a company that knows how to find the one it got.